So thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Kai Bird and T J Stiles. Kai Bird is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist. He is the acclaimed author of biographies of John J. McCloy and McGeorge and William Bundy. He won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for American Prometheus, the triumph and tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. His work includes critical writings on the Vietnam War, Hiroshima, nuclear weapons, the Cold War, and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the CIA. Bird's new book, The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, is an essential reevaluation of the complex triumphs and tragedy of Jimmy Carter's presidential legacy. 4 decades after Ronald Reagan's landslide win in 1980, Jimmy Carter's one-term presidency is often labeled a failure. Indeed, many Americans view Carter as the only ex-president to have used the White House as a stepping stone to greater achievements. But in retrospect, the Carter political odyssey is a rich and human story, marked by both formidable accomplishments and painful political adversity. 40 years before today's broad public reckoning with the vast gulf between America's creed and its actions, Carter looked out over a nation torn by race, crippled by stagflation, and demoralized by both Watergate and Vietnam, and prescribed a radical self-examination from which voters ultimately recoiled. The cost of Carter's unshakable belief in doing the right thing would be his second term and the ascendance of Reagan. Drawing on interviews with members of Carter's administration, as well as recently unclassified documents from his presidential library, Bird delivers a profoundly thorough, clear-eyed evaluation of a president whose legacy has been debated, dismissed, and misunderstood. The Outlier is this generation's definitive account of an enigmatic presidency, both as it really happened and as it is remembered in the American consciousness. Joining Bird in conversation this evening is T J Stiles. Stiles received the Pulitzer Prize for History for Custer's Trials, A Life on the Frontier of a New America, and the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the National Book Award for Nonfiction for The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt. His first biography, Jesse James, The Last Rebel of the Civil War, won the Ambassador Book Award. He is currently writing a biography of Theodore Roosevelt. So this evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you would like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Kai and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy The Outlier along with TJ's books will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. So, Kai, TJ, we're thrilled to welcome you both. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you. I'm TJ Stiles, joining you from my home office in Berkeley, California. And I'm very grateful to have been asked to talk to Kai about this book, because I think it really is a terrific biography and a fascinating look at a fascinating subject. So Kai, thank you for bringing me into this or doing this with me.
Thank you, TJ, for doing this. I know this is an interruption in your own work on Teddy Roosevelt.
I know, you know how it is when you're working on a biography or a research-intensive book. It seems like the only nonfiction you read is directly related to your own subject. So this was actually a pleasant interruption.
Right. Okay.
I just want to start off by noting that one of my favorite send-ups of the low point in the way people have seen Jimmy Carter's presidency was on an episode of The Simpsons, when in Springfield, they unveiled a statue of Jimmy Carter with the slogan underneath, "Malays forever." And when it was unveiled, someone shouted, "History's greatest monster." So And that kind of brings me to a question about biography and nonfiction in general, and how we can kind of frame the start of how we talk about your book. Often interviewers ask, what surprised you most when writing this book? And that's really a way of getting at what will surprise us. And when you write a biography, sometimes it can be driven very much by a thesis, by a sense of there is conventional wisdom that I'm arguing against. And sometimes it's about getting at the totality, the complexity of a subject that has been insufficiently understood. And of course, those aren't mutually exclusive. So I just want to ask you, kind of in general terms, do you feel like there is a conventional wisdom or a sense that you had that you wanted to get beyond a certain understanding people had, a certain conventional wisdom? Was there a take that you had? And was there a point when you began to change your own thinking about Jimmy Carter?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. There is a conventional wisdom about Carter, and you just illustrated it with that funny story about the Malay speech, a reference to the Malay speech. Yeah, Carter doesn't, come off very well in among historians even today, and in the popular mind, he's regarded as, a decent, great, even ex-president, but a failed president. And they see him as not a very effective politician, I guess. I've always had a fascination with Carter. I was in my 20s a working reporter when he was in the White House, and I had the same sort of misgivings about him. I was working for The Nation magazine in New York City, America's oldest liberal weekly, and I thought Jimmy Carter wasn't liberal enough. And then by 1990, after I'd essentially finished writing my first biography, which was about John McCloy, and one of the chapters had to deal extensively with McCloy's involvement in the Iran hostage crisis, so I had to write about Carter in that manner. And by then he was just beginning to acquire this reputation as a great ex-president. So I couldn't understand the gap between the perception of him as a decent ex-president, a decent man, a humanitarian, and his, quote, failed presidency. So I was, as early as 1990, I was sort of scoping out whether I could do a presidential biography on him. And I backed off of it because his presidential archives were still essentially closed. Most of the presidential papers were still classified. But also I'd gone down to Atlanta, and man, I thought it was a foreign country. I knew I didn't understand the South. I knew I didn't understand Southern Baptists. I knew I grew up abroad as an expatriate American, so I really had no understanding of the role of race in America. So I backed off. Well, 30 years later, I came back to it, and I'm glad I did, because what I learned in the archives, when you start off with a biography, you dig into the archives, and it was amazing. He clearly was the hardest working president we've had in the 20th century. He read 200 or 300 pages of memos every day. He got up at 5:30 in the morning, was in the Oval Office by 6 or 6:30. He had 12-hour days. He was dealing with all sorts of big issues. And in retrospect, his presidency actually looks pretty damn good. But we can get into that. I go on.
Well, this sets us up pretty well for, I just want to generally guide us through the book and through Carter's life. And we should establish right away that very much this is focused on his presidency, that this isn't a case where you devote 1/3 to his pre-presidential years and then 1/4 to his presidential life, and then it's very much focused on his presidency. But let's talk for a moment about his rise, because I was very impressed by how you were not afraid of the contradictions and of the complexity of this individual. It didn't feel to me at all like you were out to write either a revival of to revive his reputation, to resuscitate his reputation, or to take him down a notch and argue against the viewpoint that, that he's actually this moral man that his post-presidency has cultivated, of an admirable individual. It didn't feel like you were alive to the contradictions in the man, and how he was, to put words in your mouth, both had this deep moral strain, and he had this very, he's a true believer as a Christian, and he wanted to bring that into his public life. And yet he's also ambitious and calculating. And maybe you could talk about those contradictory, or at least complex, aspects of his personality and how it contributed to his rise. I mean, what drove this man from very much rural, as you mentioned, rural Georgia roots, a very Southern white man who rises to the governorship and then eventually to the presidency? I mean, maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he's very complex and contradictory, and he's a paradox. So the best explanation I found in the literature, the journalism about Jimmy Carter, came from the gonzo journalist Hunter Thompson, who famously met him in 1974 when Carter was giving what's called the Law Day speech. And it was with Ted Kennedy in the same room, and the two men were sort of checking each other out, both knowing that they might be running against each other for the presidential nomination. And Hunter Thompson, was there sipping his bourbon, and suddenly began listening to Carter's speech, and he realized that this was an unusual politician. He later described him as the meanest politician he'd ever met. Meanest. Now, that's not a word you usually associate with Jimmy Carter, but he was extremely disciplined, pragmatic, determined, ruthless in knowing what had to be done to get elected, to achieve power. So, in that 1970 election for governorship, he walked right up to the red line with dog whistles to rural white voters, talking about how he understood their concerns for educating their children in private academies. Well, that's a dog whistle. And yet then, the next day he would be campaigning in a Black church and appealing to African Americans, speaking their language. And how could he do this? It was just a mystery to me initially. Well, Jimmy Carter is essentially a 19th century man. He grew up in Archer, Georgia, 2 miles down the road from Plains, Georgia, population 650. Archer was just a little hamlet, and he was the only little white boy there. All his playmates were African Americans. His father owned several thousand acres of land. He had tenant farmers and a few sharecroppers. And Jimmy grew up with a father who was, like most Southern white men, believed in white supremacy. But he had, as his mother, Miss Lillian, who some of us may remember fondly from her appearances on the Johnny Carson show, where she was just hilarious with her one-liners, and she was a classic sort of eccentric Southern lady who broke all the social taboos, did whatever she wanted. She was a nurse. She would go into African American homes and provide health care to Blacks or whites. She didn't discriminate. She liked to rile up her white neighbors by talking about what a great president Abraham Lincoln was. That's a taboo in the South and South Georgia in those years. But anyway, she inculcated Carter with a sense of equality, an understanding that the races were equal, and a sense of decency and a determination to do well and to read a lot of books. And Anyway, Carter was, as you say, very ambitious, determined. He knew how to get power, but he also, because of his Christian faith, this is the paradox. Once he got power, so when he won the governor's race, on the very day he was inaugurated, in his acceptance speech, he announced that the time for segregation in the South was over, shocking the audience. They were aghast. Likewise, when he won the White House in a very close campaign, he turned around and decided he wasn't going to do anything that was just politically expedient. He was going to figure out what the right thing was to do, what the smart thing, intelligent thing was to do in terms of policy, and he was going to do it regardless of the political consequences. And he got a lot accomplished. He passed more legislation than, let's say, President Obama or Bill Clinton. He controlled the House and the Senate. And people forget, but he passed a lot of very consequential legislation.
Yeah, that's actually kind of brings us forward, because it was interesting to me that you made a choice, which I think was a very good one, to not to get bogged down in a lot of the details about campaigning and politics. I mean, we don't go through chapters of details of primary fights, et cetera. I can imagine that you have pages of notes or all sorts of reading you did, and you thought, you know what, this is not the story I'm telling. But then when he gets, but you know, he had this very ruthless and politically astute campaigning that he did, and not all of it pretty, like you mentioned when he was running for governor. He gets into the White House, and I think there was something that was typified by the way the Secret Service changed his code name. What was that? What was that change?
It was from Dasher to the Deacon.
Yes, Deacon. I mean, there's something about those code names. I mean, whoever's in charge of that is a very smart person in the Secret Service. And the way in which, you know, like the complexity of his relationship, maybe we could talk a little bit to talk about both those accomplishments and also the difficulty he had. Some of the other personalities around him were so fascinating at the way in which, you know, they merged or didn't merge with Washington society, with the kind of the institutions of the Capitol, like Washington Post, a lot of the kind of policy making behind the scenes kingpins in the Georgetown set, as you put it,
Right.
and then also Tip O'Neill and the often difficult relationship that Carter had with Tip O'Neill. And, you know, it was fascinating to me to see how Carter has, you know, it's so hard to put him into a box. The way in which he was concerned about, in a very kind of Southern white businessman way, and I'm not condemning him for that. That's not in a negative sense, but just in a very kind of conventional establishment, conservative small c way. He was worried about the budget. He's worried about responsible spending. Being responsible was a big part of the way he viewed his administration of government. And yet he also had big dreams. He had hopes, and he had this moralism. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about his relationship with Tip O'Neill, for example, and how that played out.
You know, his biggest problem when he arrived in Washington was that he was a complete stranger to the city. You know, the day before he was inaugurated, he confessed to his vice president, Walter Mondale, that he'd never been inside the White House. And he asked him, well, is it a nice place to live? And he arrived surrounded by his Georgia mafia, who were, you know, people like Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, who were all of 32 and 33, and good old boys from South Georgia, but really sharp and smart. And he had also a guy named Charlie Curbo, who was his personal lawyer, who was described to me by many people as the Atticus Finch, you know, the character from the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. He was this, you know, South Georgia lawyer, very slow talking, quiet, spoke in just about a whisper. And he, had no knowledge of the workings of Washington or the Georgetown set. But Curbo was a Southern populist who whispered into Carter's ears, and he was his closest advisor, but completely unknown. And these guys, I should say, in my first interview with Carter, he was a difficult interview. We had a series of interviews, but he was always very busy with his Carter Center activities as an ex-president. He's still trying to wipe out guinea worm disease and such. And so he would give me the time, but he was impatient with familiar questions. So fortunately, I asked the very first interview, I asked him about Charlie Curbo, his longtime lawyer. And I pointed out to him that, I couldn't find many papers, any letters or memos from Curbo to him in the presidential archive. And his bright blue eyes lit up and said, well, that's odd. Charlie wrote me all the time. And so he turned to his aide and said, we need to find those papers. Well, 3 days later, I got a phone call from his aide saying we found 5 cardboard boxes in the attic of Curbo's widow. And about 6 months later, I was allowed to go through those boxes, and I quote from them heavily. And it's a real window into Carter's mind and his, true political thinking on everything from what he should say about the Vietnam War when he was still governor, to race, to how he should run the campaign. But coming back to Washington, these guys had no experience with the Washington set. And Carter, admitted to me later that it probably was a mistake that he turned down so many dinner invitations from Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, who was the grand lady of the Georgetown set. And, he thought that was a waste of time. It wasn't his scene to show up at a cocktail party and chat with powerful Washington personalities. So I
just want to mention that it was so interesting how, his earnestness at times was a disadvantage. That he was purposeful that would verge over into self-righteousness, or he was serious, and yet he was sometimes that made him cold and very difficult in a way that I think hurt him. I mean, don't you think so? Though sometimes some of the stories about how Hamilton Jordan was asked by a Washington Post columnist, is it Jordan or Jordan? And he said, my friends call me Jordan, so you can call me Jordan. So,
there was a certain defiance.
So many great nuggets. Yes.
Among these Southern boys. They knew that they were regarded as country bumpkins. And so they would play to that perception with a certain defiance. And they didn't care what the Washington Post thought. And, there was a cost to this, of course. So, you asked about the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. Well, Tip O'Neill was this Irish politician from Boston who thought of politics in sort of New Deal terms. I'm trying to bring pork barrel projects to my constituency. And we liberal Democrats are about spending money in the government. And here comes this guy from Georgia with sort of a small town fiscal conservative bent about the federal budget. And he starts slashing pork barrel projects. Well, Tip O'Neill went ballistic. He also couldn't understand why Carter, couldn't serve a decent breakfast at a White House meeting or, a little bourbon on the rocks. Carter actually was a drinker himself. He occasionally would have a scotch, but he decided when he looked at the amount of that the White House and his predecessors were spending on hard liquor, it was thousands and thousands of dollars, and he just stopped it. He would serve red and white wine and beer, but no hard liquor.
Yeah, all those little signals he was sending, all those small ways in which he was conserving energy, or being careful about spending in his own household, so to speak, in the White House. I mean, it really sent a message, didn't it? People really noticed and responded to that.
Yeah, no, and it fed into the notion that they were out of their depth, rural white Southern boys with these strange accents, and that they really didn't know what they were doing. Well, that was the perception, and the Washington Post in particular, and Sally Quinn, the wife of Ben Bradley, the editor of the Post at the time, really skewered the Georgia boys and Carter repeatedly in her style section articles. But again, just review the accomplishments. It's amazing. I mean, if you like a good beer, a boutique beer, a craft beer, you have to thank Jimmy Carter, because he's the guy who made it happen in the late 70s. He's the guy who deregulated American Airlines so that middle-class Americans could travel for the first time on a reasonable basis. He deregulated the trucking industry, natural gas, which began to sort of take the steps towards energy independence. He appointed more African American and Hispanics to the federal bench than all his predecessors combined. He was worried about the federal budget, so he didn't like spending money on big projects. He canceled the B-1 bomber because he thought it was wasteful and a stupid weapon. But he was willing to spend money on poor people, so he expanded the role for food stamps by 3 million people, largely African Americans in the South. So he was a radical in many ways, and he was willing, on the foreign policy field, it's also just a stunning list. I mean, he passed the Panama Canal Treaty, SALT II Arms Control Treaty. He normalized relations with China. He passed the first immigration reform bill in decades that allowed asylum, people to apply for asylum. He made human rights, the notion that human rights is a principle that should be at the core of U.S. foreign policy decisions. And no one has been able to take that back. It's politicians still have to talk about human rights. And then, of course, he did the Camp David Accords, negotiating and it was all due to his own personal diplomacy, a treaty between Egypt and Israel, taking Egypt off the battlefield for Israel. But oddly enough, he got very little credit for all of these things. Well,
yeah, I think one of the interesting things about so many of these accomplishments, which you made the transition I was going to ask you to make, which is he has all these difficulties. He's got some personality issues that make things harder for himself. And yet he was able to accomplish so much. But it is striking that, and again, it seems like this reflects the kind of serious, thoughtful man who didn't concern himself with the political repercussions. In fact, was upset when people talked about the politics of policy. That so many of these issues, like for example, in deregulation, had some short-term costs, even though they paved the way for the long-term development. So, for example, deregulating the oil and gas markets, especially natural gas, meant that you had in certain areas price boosts. But then that encouraged the development of new sources and of new production. Or something actually you didn't mention in the book, because it's fine. It's a minor thing in the scheme of things, and yet still very big. He completed the deregulation of the freight rail industry, and the United States has moves, almost half of the freight ton miles are by rail, which is incredibly efficient and good for the environment as well. And there are all these ways in which the long-term trajectory of the economy was changed, because deregulation at that point really was a matter of overturning a sort of incrustation of even centuries of more than a century of regulation that was no longer rational.
Right.
And it wasn't what later became seen as just simply a sop to business. I mean, there were businesses, large corporations and industries that were upset at some of his deregulation because they had entrenched interests. It was really fascinating. And yet I think Ronald Reagan actually reaped some of the benefit of some
Ronald
stuff.
Reagan gets the credit for doing all these things, and
Mhm.
Carter gets no brownie points at all for it. But there were political costs. So you deregulate the airline industry. Well, that actually weakens the labor unions that are representing those workers in the short term.
Yeah.
And, that hurts his liberal constituency. So he did a lot of things that sort of pissed off liberals. So for instance, the big thing, I mean, one of the reasons he didn't get reelected was that Ted Kennedy ran against him, tried to take the nomination and he ran on one issue, essentially, healthcare. And, Ted Kennedy famously had made sort of the idea of universal healthcare, a single payer plan, his signature issue. And Carter actually also campaigned on that in 1976. He endorsed it. But when he got into the White House, he looked at the budget, thought there wasn't the money there, it was too expensive, and he thought that Kennedy didn't have the votes in the Senate to pass such a sweeping piece of legislation. So he proposed a compromise, and they came to blows over this, and Kennedy refused to compromise. Carter refused to compromise, but Carter's program, which would have established universal catastrophic health insurance, would have been an enormous foot in the door to building a real universal healthcare system, but it went down to defeat. Kennedy then ran against him for the nomination and really weakened him. Carter was ruthless in campaigning against Kennedy. He famously told the press that he was going to whip Ted Kennedy's ass, and he did eventually, but it weakened him for the general election when he had to face Ronald Reagan. And then, of course, he also had to face at that point the Iran hostage crisis, which was a complete albatross.
Well, that's actually a good turning point, because what I was hoping to do is just what we've done, talk about some of the accomplishments, how he really moved the needle and just changed the presidency in permanent ways, changed the American economy, the way Americans think about things. I mean, to think that there was an America in which basically government regulation mandated that, you got your beer from Budweiser and a few others is pretty amazing.
Right.
And yet, there were costs. There were costs in terms of society to some of these, as you mentioned, with weakening labor unions, et cetera, alienating part of his liberal base. But there really came about sort of a storm of events, some domestic, many of them global. And in reading your biography and kind of being reminded, of just what a tidal wave of one disaster or crisis after another, while he was dealing with domestic issues that were made even worse by these international disasters. And then you had the way in which his personality was being singled out and being mocked. And there's the kind of turning point in the way the press was beginning to see him, which I think probably that turning point came with James Fallows's essay about Carter. And maybe you could talk about that turning point and that kind of tidal wave of events that really weighed so heavily on the last part of his presidency.
Well, you mentioned James Fallows. He's still a working journalist for the Atlantic.
I admire him very much. Yeah,
a great reporter. He takes on big issues and writes long essays in the Atlantic. Well, Fallows in the late 70s was a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter as a young man in his late 20s. And he worked there 2 years, and then he left to go back to journalism, his first love. And the very first piece he wrote in the Atlantic was called The Passionless Presidency. And it was a takedown of the Carter presidency. and a sort of catalog of all the mistakes that they had made so far, and as Fallows described it, as sort of a warning to have a midterm correction, I guess. But the Carter people, I think, justifiably regarded it as a stab in the back, and it was a sort of signal to the rest of the press that they could go after Carter. And the one thing that's oddly enough remembered vividly by most Americans from the story and about the Carter presidency in general is that Jimmy Carter paid attention to detail, so much so that he even managed the White House tennis court schedule. And actually, I dig into that story and tell what actually happened. Carter wasn't actually managing the tennis court schedule, but his secretary had a sign-up sheet, and there was a misunderstanding between Fallows and Carter over what was going on. But anyway, you're right. By the time that piece came out in the Atlantic in May of 1979, Carter was dealing with long gas lines, gasoline prices that were over shockingly $1 a gallon, and stagflation, interest rates of like over 13, 14%, inflation rates of, in the 8, 9% category. And the Iran Revolution, which put a stop to Iranian oil exports, just exacerbated all this. Mm-hmm. So he was, as you suggest, he was dealing with a tsunami of historical events that he actually had no real control over. It just, he tried to manage stagflation. He thought that because interest rates were so high and inflation was running, he blamed the federal deficit. And I think he was wrong about that in a Keynesian way. He didn't understand Keynesian economics. The inflation rate was being driven by energy prices, and that was all due to the Iranian Revolution, which was a temporary event. But in the end, Carter did the tough thing, and probably in retrospect, the right thing. He appointed Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve, knowing that Volcker was a hardliner on inflation and was going to just jack up interest rates even more and put a screech on the economy, just as Carter was beginning to launch his re-election bid. Similarly, with the Iran hostage crisis, he had no control over the Iran Revolution. It was going to happen. The Shah had become increasingly unpopular. The revolution occurred, and to the surprise of even the experts on Iran, it went down the road towards a theocratic Shia dictatorship with Ayatollah Khomeini in charge. And Carter, for the longest time, resisted the advice from all of his people and from John McCloy and David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, who were all lobbying him vociferously to admit the Shah for a political asylum after he was overthrown. Carter knew that this might precipitate an even greater crisis. He even in his diaries, which are just fabulous resources, in his diary, he predicted that if I let the Shah into this country to play tennis here, they may take over our embassy and take hostages. Well, he resisted this for 6 months and finally agreed to give the Shah asylum on humanitarian grounds for medical reasons, being told that he had cancer. And of course, that's what happened. The embassy was taken over, and then his advisors began telling him, you got to do something strong. You got to have a military response. And Carter refused. His national security advisors, Big Brzezinski, whom he clashed with all the time. This is another sort of unknown fact of the Carter administration, but the two men, they liked each other, but they argued all the time. Well, Brzezinski gave Carter advice to sort of respond in a military fashion to the hostage taking, and Carter refused because he believed that would jeopardize the lives of the hostages, and he was determined to bring them all home safe. And he believed that in the advice that he was getting from his Secretary of State, Cy Vance, that diplomacy would in the end work and we would get these people out. But again, this came at an enormous political cost. The American people sort of lost confidence in Carter's leadership as the hostage crisis was prolonged for 444 days.
Yeah, that was interesting to me because it reflected again some of the tensions within Carter himself and within his administration, which is the way in which he made human rights, put human rights at the forefront of his foreign policy, the way in which, we haven't talked about the First Lady at all. I mean, she was a major presence, and that was a major departure in the way in which she even played a role in foreign policy, interacting directly with foreign leaders. And then you also have hardliners like Brzezinski. And there's this tension. And as you mentioned, he resisted letting the Shah in for a long time, but then eventually he did. Right. Then he resisted, a military mission, but then eventually he agrees to one. And that seems to me, a part of the contradictions are part of Carter's tragedy, that what makes him is successful in so many areas, his insistence on doing the right thing, his own sense of probity and responsibility, of morality, and yet his also, his coldness, his realism, there are all these kind of personality traits that seem to be at work in the administration and his policymaking too.
Yeah.
I mean, there is, I don't know, maybe actually one way we can talk about this is, before we start taking questions, is this whole way in which the Malay speech was really misrepresented, as has often been noted. And as you note, he didn't use the word Malays. Right. And yet that seems to be a decisive moment in the perception of the Carter administration, leading to a surprisingly narrow defeat in 1980. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the Malay speech is the real turning point, and it's, as you say, it's greatly misunderstood. Carter did that because out of frustration with the energy crisis, he was told by his advisors he should give yet another speech on energy and conservation. And he looked at the draft of the speech, and he was sitting there in Camp David with Rosie, as he called Rosalind Carter, his wife and closest advisor. And he just said, I think this is a speech that no one's going to listen to. And she agreed and told him to throw it away. And then he proceeded to have what is known as the Camp David Domestic Summit, which was an extraordinary event. No president has ever subjected himself to this. But over the course of 10 days, he invited one representative group after another up to the Camp David, religious leaders, well-known editors, academics, to talk to him about where the country was headed and what he should do. And it was sort of an exercise in self-criticism. And there you had the President of the United States wearing blue jeans, sitting on the floor, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, listening to people. And he did this for 10 days. And then he came out and gave this speech. And it was a remarkable speech. It looks today, if you read it today, as opposed to listen to it with that Southern accent, if you read the speech, it's actually quite prescient. He's talking about how Americans need to understand the limits of the environment, the limits of our materialism, that we can't seek happiness in just material goods, that we need to have an appreciation for community. We can't just be thinking about the individual. We need to start taking care of our planet, climate change. It was very prescient and tough. And people were rather stunned by it. You know, his polling ratings after that speech immediately shot up by 10, 15 points.
Yeah, which is something you'd never know now.
Yeah, right. People listened to that and said, well, that's an odd speech, but you know, he's telling us the truth.
Mhm.
And then 5 days later, he he ostensibly fired his whole cabinet. He actually only dismissed 5 out of his cabinet secretaries, people that 2 of them actually had said they wanted to leave anyway. And this was regarded by the pundits in the press as a sign of weakness, of confusion, of turmoil in the administration. And so the so-called Malay Speech, which is how the press began characterizing it, talking about the malaise that was extant in the country, that was long forgotten, and after the cabinet firings, his polling numbers plummeted, and he was he got no political credit for this. But yeah, but it became a real turning point. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting how he was very willing to deliver bad news and tough messages, and I think it's no surprise that Americans went for the guy who was characterized as shining city on the hill, and yet Reagan, who benefited, including with Volcker, who you mentioned, in so many ways from what Carter had done to prepare the way. Okay, we're going to do a lightning round of questions, then we're going to take some listener questions. If you haven't, people, typed in the Q&A some of your questions, we're going to take them in a minute. But just a quick rapid fire set of questions. First of all, who brought bongs into the White House?
I'm sorry, who brought what?
Bongs. Devices for smoking marijuana.
Carter's sons. Jeff Carter.
They're actually found by the cleanup crew.
Right. And
second,
they used them on the roof of the White House, and on one occasion at least with Willie Nelson.
Yes. Well, that's the next question. Music. Name some of the musicians he was friends with and he actually brought into the White House.
Well, Greg Allman and the Allman Brothers Band, and Willie Nelson came repeatedly to the White House. They were actually good friends. Carter also, you know, he loved classical music, but he, in the 60s, acquired a real appreciation for Bob Dylan. And he loved jazz. And he had this fantastic jazz event on the south lawn of the White House, where he had all the greats, Dizzy Gillespie and
Max Roach, and yeah.
And he got up there and he sang Salt Peanuts famously with Dizzy Gillespie on the horn. Anyway, it was a most unusual White House concert.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. Okay, I'll add a couple other questions, but they were all just minor things. Let's take some questions from the audience. One which I think is really interesting, a really good question. Did Carter enjoy being president? I mean, did he take any joy from it? You know, he was such a, you know, he comes across as this so serious and so focused, and yet there's also those moments like the jazz concert you just mentioned. I mean, how would you answer that?
Well, he claims that he did enjoy the job, and I think he did. He just, you know, he's a workaholic, and he loved getting up. He kept farmer's hours. He'd get up at 5:30, and he spent really long hours, but he enjoyed it, and he enjoyed grappling with the issues. You know, he was a very well-read man. I think he arguably is the most intelligent and well-read president we've had in the 20th century. And he took pleasure from it. Now, he did not take pleasure from the wheeling and dealing. You know, I tell one story in the book about how he had over a couple of senators to play tennis with him on the White House court. And they played the game. And then Carter turned around after the game was over and walked back to the Oval Office. And his aide turned to him in the Oval Office and said, "Mr. President, they really were expecting you to invite them into the Oval Office and maybe have a drink and, schmooze." And he looked at him and said, "I did what you asked. I played tennis with them."
That reminds me of Barack Obama's famous comment when he was told he should have a drink with Mitch McConnell. "You have a drink with Mitch McConnell."
Actually,
Yeah,
there are a lot of
it's hard to
similarities
fake.
between Obama and Carter. They both are very intelligent, and they hated the politicking once they
Small
were in
talks.
office. Yeah, the small talks.
Yeah. Speaking of which, maybe you could just talk briefly about his relationship with, I think, the youngest senator at the time, Joseph R. Biden Jr., I believe his name was.
Well, actually, they were political allies.
Mhm.
The young Biden from Delaware had very similar political positions and sort of orientation as Carter. He was the first senator to endorse Jimmy Carter in the '76 campaign, fairly early on. Biden's a Catholic. He takes his religion seriously. So does Jimmy Carter. They had similar positions on abortion. They supported a woman's right to choose, but they were opposed to federal funding of abortions in Medicare, for instance. And so, Carter would have disputes with Gloria Steinem about this as a result. Biden was, a pragmatist. They had a similar position on busing. And yet, I think they're both, what the similarities also today lap over into the fact that they're both very decent men.
Mhm.
And, they have integrity, their personal morality is, spotless. And I think there's a good chance that Biden, in his old age, who will sort of become the kind of president that Carter was, in that he will, knowing that he has there's no downside. He's going to try to just do the right thing, and aggressively do the right thing. And anyway, I think they had a lot of compatibility when Carter was in the White House.
Well, there's a couple of questions that are I'd like to bring in before we finish. One is somebody asked about his work in terms of civil liberties domestically, and his approach to civil liberties. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit, since that was a question from the audience.
Yeah, well, Carter was very good on civil rights, civil liberties. He was a liberal on social issues. The perception of him as a conservative is simply that he was sort of a small town fiscal conservative.
Mm-hmm.
But he, as I said, he appointed scores of African Americans to the federal bench, and many more to high-ranking federal service jobs, and women and Hispanics. And to this day, well, again, coming back to this perception of his ex-presidency as being so very successful, I think it's a seamless life, actually. The guy you see who's the ex-president, who's working for Habitat for Humanity and trying to monitor elections abroad and support democracy, and is the same guy who was in the White House 40 years ago. And
also has occasionally had prickly relationships with serving presidents. I mean, some of whom I think he should have had prickly relations with, but he's not always. Jimmy Carter comes across as someone who is enormously decent, but can be difficult. Yeah. And that seems to be a seamless aspect of him as well. I just want to go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was going to follow up on that. All the pictures you see of Carter with any of the ex-presidents when they gather together, it's very noticeable that Carter is always off to one side,
Yeah.
separated by about 3 feet. And I think it's because, you know, they all, this includes Obama too, and Bill Clinton in particular, they've all experienced Carter's willingness to go off territory and to, you know, so Carter famously went off to North Korea and negotiated a nuclear agreement to try to eliminate the nuclear bomb program in North Korea without the permission of President Clinton. And he did the same thing with Obama. And they all sort of, I think, are a little squeamish about his presence because he sort of stands in moral judgment of how they're running their own ex-presidencies.
He's still the deacon.
He's still the deacon, exactly.
Well, that's just, I want to just wrap up with there were a couple of questions about foreign policy. And one of which asks about, again, Rosalind's influence and her role in it. And another is just his strategic thinking. And somebody who had actually is taught naval and strategic military courses believes that he's had a very clear-headed response to the Soviets as a strategist. And maybe you could reflect on those two questions. You know, he was a naval officer. He was a protege of Admiral Rickover, and he came into the White House with that experience. He had a very strong wife who was very close to and who he emphasized that he relied on a great deal. I want to give you a couple of minutes to talk about that aspect of his presidency also.
Sure. Well, it's true. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He had a 7-year career in the Navy. He was a protege of Admiral Rickover. He was on his way to sort of a brilliant naval career after 7 years when he suddenly resigned. He resigned because his father suddenly died. And he decided, over the violent opposition of Rosie, his Rosalind Carter, he decided he had to go back to Plains, Georgia, and manage the family farm, the peanut business. And she didn't want to go. And on the long drive back, she hardly spoke to him. But he took away from the Navy experience, I think, a certain skepticism about the military bureaucracy. And he confessed to one friend that he actually, you know, he had to go back and take over the family business for personal reasons, but he also had decided that he wasn't sure he wanted to spend the rest of his life managing weapons of mass destruction and potentially running, you know, a war. That just wasn't who he was. And I think that was right. So he brought to the White House a skepticism about the Cold War. He did not agree with Zbig Brzezinski, his national security advisor's view of the Cold War. You know, Zbig had the notion that every issue, whether it was Nicaragua or Poland or India or China or Vietnam, could only be acted on and seen through the prism of America's rivalry with the Soviet Union. And Zbig, you know, was a Polish-American aristocrat whose father had been a Polish diplomat, and he hated the Russians. And he brought this prejudice to his worldview. Carter didn't agree with it. He understood that third world revolutions like in Nicaragua or Iran happened for internal reasons, and that it had often nothing to do with the Cold War or the Soviet-American rivalry. So he had actually a brilliant strategic view of the world, and his human rights policy, in retrospect, was far more significant in bringing down an early end to the Cold War than Ronald Reagan's supposed upping of the defense budget. and outspending the Soviets. That had far less to do with, and it was far less threatening than Carter's human rights policy, which actually undermined the Soviet empire in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland. And that was the true beginning of the unraveling of the evil empire. So his foreign policy actually was very sophisticated and brilliant. He, again, coming back to the Middle East, he doesn't get credit for Camp David, but he was attempting to solve this highly intractable problem. He's succeeded with Egypt and Israel. He thought he had a deal to have a roadmap for Palestinian self-determination, and then Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, reneged. And Carter believes that he actually lied to him at Camp David. And this is why he has for 40 years pressed relentlessly on the issue of the settlements in the West Bank, knowing that this is a roadblock to a potential two-state solution, a roadblock to peace. The more settlers that and settlements that are built in the West Bank, it just makes it impossible to have a two-state solution. So he's been very prescient in his foreign policy.
I just want to close with, because we're at the end, but your book is really filled with wonderful telling details. And there are so many, I mentioned one at the outset, the Secret Service nickname that switched from Dasher to Deacon, which said so much about him. And one of them was in your terrific account of the Camp David negotiations, when Sadat presents his plan for peace, which is, of course, a maximalist Egyptian Arab position. And Menachem Begin, who's the former terrorist, basically, and freedom fighter, who's on the hard right of Israeli politics. And so for 90 minutes, you describe how Sadat presents his case, and then Carter says at the end of this, and you can see Begin's getting upset, and Carter says, well, it would save us all a lot of time if you could just sign that without any changes. And they both men just crack up, and they burst into laughter. And again, as have these moments when you see the very moralistic and very almost self-righteous Carter, and then there are these other moments when when he just says exactly the right thing and he keeps things moving. And it's that complexity, that richness, that again, it's not about apologizing for Carter and making him into reviving him as the greatest president of the 20th century. It's certainly not about taking him down. It's really filling in this complex, rich human being who accomplished a lot, faced a lot, had these tragic aspects of his life and presidency. And it's a terrific biography.
Well, thank you, TJ. It is a colorful story, and I'm glad I chose you to encourage you to try to interrogate me. It's been fun.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. It was such a pleasure to host you both this evening. And thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight. Please consider purchasing a copy of The Outlier. We've got it right here. And you can do that at powells.com. While there, be sure to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you again at another one of our events soon. So Kai and TJ, thanks again so much. And we're grateful for you guys being here and having such a great conversation. So
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Real pleasure.
Bye.